Titled Rise, the film begins by showing a handsome young nurse named Will who is working to save a patient in the ER. Thanks to his quick and skilled CPR, the patient slowly starts to recover. The doctors and other nurses praise Will for his excellent work. However, that night, Will's luck takes a turn. His friends invite him out to a nightclub where he meets a girl named Jane. They drink together until they're both completely wasted. The next morning, 2 police officers suddenly show up at Will's house and arrest him without giving him a chance to ask what's going on. They search his room and find illegal drugs, and Will is immediately taken to the police station. It turns out Will is being accused of sexually assaulting Jane, the very girl he met at the club the night before. At the trial, Jane even testified that Will had forced himself on her while she was intoxicated under the influence of drugs. Hearing that accusation, Will immediately denied it, insisting that he clearly remembered they had only been drinking together for hours and nothing more. Unfortunately, Will's defense didn't convince the jury, especially since the illegal drugs found in his room were presented as evidence against him. In the end, the judge found Will guilty and sentenced him to 6 years in prison. After being processed and searched, Will was transported to prison along with 3 other new inmates. During the ride, a prisoner named Benji tried to act overly friendly, chatting nonstop the whole way. Meanwhile, another prisoner who looked like a nerd named Reed stayed silent, intimidated by Benji's tough appearance. Annoyed by Benji's loud talking, another prisoner named Jimmy ended up punching him, knocking him out cold.
You know they got cameras in stores now?
Yeah, well, just as well, mate.
A dead man.
Hey, really?
When they finally arrived at the prison, the new inmates were greeted with a rowdy and noisy welcome from the other prisoners. To make matters worse, a flamboyant inmate even tried flirting with Will because of his good looks. As they got out of the transport van, the 4 were ordered to line up neatly. A female corrections officer approached and informed them that Will, Benji, and Reed would be placed in the same cell block, Sector B, while Jimmy would be assigned to a separate cell. After getting his prison uniform, Will headed to his cell. There he met his cellmate, Butch. Besides Butch, Will also got to know another inmate named George, who seemed religious because he always carried a holy book with him. George asked Will how long he would be serving. When Will replied that he was sentenced to 6 years but was filing an appeal, George warned him that appeals usually take a long time, since many inmates here were also appealing their sentences, claiming they were innocent. George advised Will to stay out of trouble if he wanted to survive in this prison. Because every inmate was required to work, Will, who had a background in nursing, was assigned to care for a severely ill inmate named Feng Poi, earning $5 a day. With no choice, Will reluctantly accepted the assignment. That same day, he started working as Feng's caretaker. Even when Will tried to study law by reading books about sexual assault cases, he had to bring Feng along to the library. While they were walking across the yard, an inmate named Jimmy called out to him. Grabbing Will aggressively, Jimmy questioned whether a guard named Walsh had placed him with Butch and ordered him to care for Feng. In pain, Will could only nod and agree with everything Jimmy said. Before letting him go, Jimmy warned Will not to trust anyone inside the prison.
Don't trust no one.
Later, as Will was helping Feng use the restroom, Officer Walsh showed up and told Will he had a visitor. When Will reached the front gate, he found out the visitor was Detective Rossi, the same officer who had arrested him before. Unfortunately, Rossi didn't bring good news. He informed Will that his appeal had been denied by the court, meaning Will would have to spend the next 6 years of his youth behind bars. Feeling devastated by the news, Will immediately called his lawyer, Francis, to ask why the appeal was rejected, even though he had fulfilled all the required procedures. Over the phone, Francis explained that it wasn't just about following procedures, Will also needed solid evidence to prove his innocence. Francis assured him he was working on finding a skilled investigator who could help uncover the evidence needed to win the appeal. The next day, Will received another visitor this time. It was his mother. While with Feng, Will was escorted to the visitation room to meet her. When they saw each other, his mother gave him a charm that once belonged to Will's late father, telling him to keep it for protection against harm. She also asked how Will was holding up in prison, clearly worried that her son wouldn't be able to survive in such a harsh place. It was obvious that she still couldn't accept the fact that Will was being punished for a crime he didn't commit. Overwhelmed with frustration, Will's mother began shouting about how the justice system was corrupt, how it oppressed the weak and locked people up without properly checking the evidence. Because of the commotion she caused, the guards eventually had to escort her out of the facility. Day by day, Will managed to live peacefully and quietly in prison. He even started making friends with some of the other inmates. He was later seen enjoying one of the secret underground fights held by prisoners who had bribed the guards to turn a blind eye. The inmates would place bets and cheer for their favorite fighters. Unfortunately, Will's peace didn't last long. One day, prison guards suddenly raided his cell and found contraband hidden under Will's pillow. But the drugs actually belonged to Butch, who had framed Will to avoid punishment himself. As a result, Will was disciplined by the head warden and placed under 24-hour surveillance from that moment on. Meanwhile, outside the prison, Francis met with a lawyer friend named Julie. He pleaded with her to take on Will's case, insisting that Will was truly innocent. However, Julie refused, explaining that the judge who sentenced Will was notorious for never accepting appeals without rock-solid evidence. She didn't want to risk her career over a case that had almost no chance of winning. Jokingly, Julie told Francis that if he really wanted her to take the case, he would have to put down a $40,000 retainer first. Back in prison, Will was visited by his old friend John. During their conversation, Will opened up about how he couldn't forgive Jane for setting him up and ruining his life. But John, being deeply religious, advised him to eventually find it in his heart to forgive Jane so he could live in peace someday. Still, Will wasn't ready. He couldn't accept everything that had happened. The false accusation had destroyed his reputation, cost him his job, his friends, and his entire youth. While working out in the prison yard, Will receives a letter from Liz, the daughter of his old friend John. In heartfelt words, Liz apologizes for not visiting him in person, admitting she couldn't bear to see him like this, and thanks her father for checking in on Will on her behalf. Receiving Liz's letter made Will even more determined to get out of prison. If he couldn't do it through legal means, he began to seriously consider escaping by any means necessary. Driven by this new resolve, Will approached Jimmy and asked for his help planning an escape. Unfortunately, Jimmy refused, not wanting Will to risk everything and make things worse for himself. In the middle of their conversation, a fight suddenly broke out in the yard. Jimmy rushed over to try to break it up, but the guards mistakenly thought he was involved. As a result, Jimmy was punished and thrown into solitary confinement. Days turned into weeks, and after several months, Will's good behavior earned him a transfer. He was finally moved out of the cell he shared with Butch and reassigned to room with George, a religious and peaceful inmate. Meanwhile, Francis was still working hard to convince Julie to take Will's case. In prison, life became a little easier for Will. Without Butch constantly around, he found peace and spent more time reading books, searching for any possible way to win his appeal. Still, Butch wasn't completely out of the picture. One day, after Will had just bought some instant noodles, canned milk, and soda with the wages he earned from prison labor, Butch tried to steal them. But this time, Will stood his ground and refused. Those items were hard-earned, and he wasn't about to give them up without a fight. Hearing Will's firm refusal stunned Butch. He hadn't expected anyone to have the guts to stand up to him. During lunch, Will runs into Jimmy at the cafeteria. It turns out Jimmy had also been moved to Sector B, the same as Will. There, Jimmy makes a shocking offer. He tells Will he's willing to take care of the woman who wronged him in exchange for a $10,000 payment. But Will, who has grown wiser and more grounded, immediately refuses. Even though he hasn't fully forgiven Jane, he would never ask someone to harm another human being. He insists that Jimmy isn't that kind of person either. However, Jimmy opens up about his dark past, revealing that he had killed someone when he was just a child. "I'm not as good as you think," he says quietly. That night, unable to sleep, Will pours out his frustration into a heartfelt letter addressed to Jane, the woman who had falsely accused him. Through tears, he writes that he never once forced himself on her. Everything that happened between them was consensual. Though he still doesn't understand why Jane betrayed him, Will ends the letter by offering forgiveness, hoping to free himself from the burden of hatred. One day, Butch storms into Will's cell, trying to intimidate him again. But George, Will's new cellmate, steps in. He overwhelms Butch with a relentless stream of religious lectures until Butch is completely baffled. Later, with Fung standing guard outside, Will and George play a clever trick on Butch, pretending he's possessed by evil spirits. George even stages a mock exorcism, splashing tap water on him and chanting loudly, leaving Butch terrified and confused. Soon after, Will receives an unexpected visitor, Julie, the lawyer. She explains that after hearing Will's full story from Francis, she couldn't, in good conscience, walk away. Even though she was reluctant at first, she now agrees to take on Will's case, determined to fight for someone unjustly punished. Will is overjoyed and immediately calls Francis to thank him. Francis advises him to stay patient, warning that building a solid case would take time. As Will is talking to Francis, the prison's emergency alarm suddenly blares. Word spreads quickly. Benji, one of the most feared inmates, has been found severely injured, barely clinging to life.
Code Blue, all prisoners return to your cells immediately.
The brutal reality of prison hits Will hard. Anything, no matter how unthinkable, can happen here. But instead of breaking him, it only makes Will stronger. No longer an easy target, Will stands up to guards and senior inmates who try to bully him. He bonds with his fellow inmates, playing card games like dominoes daily, and even begins boxing training with Jimmy. To toughen up his image, Will shaves his head bald. One day, while cleaning up in the bathroom, Jimmy tells Will that he's heading to court to fight for his case. Jimmy is torn. If he pleads guilty, his sentence could be extended by 10 more years. But if he pleads not guilty, he'll face a trial and be transferred to another facility. Will, realizing the gravity of Jimmy's choice, offers no advice, only hope that Jimmy makes the right decision. With a heavy heart, Will watches Jimmy leave for court, praying for his friend's freedom. Later, while spending time with Fung, Officer Walsh starts harassing Will with trash talk. Fung tries to defend him, but Walsh strikes Fung violently, triggering his chronic illness. Enraged, George charges in and beats down Walsh.
Everybody knows why you were his friend. You'd be dead in here.
I said leave him! Leave him more!
Finally, after months of waiting, Will's appeal hearing takes place. His family, friends, Francis, and Julie all show up to support him. At trial, Julie presents new evidence proving Will's innocence. The opposing lawyer tries everything to discredit her, but Julie holds firm. Finally, the key evidence arrives, a lab report confirming that Jane's urine sample contained only a trace amount of sedative, far too little to impair her or justify any claims of being drugged. This critical evidence proves that Will did not drug or assault Jane. A few days later, the court announces its decision. Will's appeal has been granted. That same day, he officially regains his freedom.
We won. Yep. You're free to go.
Before leaving, Will bids a heartfelt farewell to his prison friends. Fung, who had come to see Will as a brother, breaks down in tears. Although Will longed for freedom, he knows he'll never forget the hard but valuable lessons he learned behind bars. In the final scene, Will is seen relaxing on a beautiful beach, his dream destination. Suddenly, Jimmy appears, smiling wide. Having also been declared innocent, Jimmy is free at last. The two friends embrace, celebrating their hard-won freedom. Life will knock you down again and again, but as long as you have the courage to get back up, you will never be truly defeated. Remember, truth will never stay buried, as long as good people are willing to fight for justice. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and see you again next time.